She thought she held all the power, a celebrated CEO, untouchable in her glass tower. To her, the man waiting behind the wheel was invisible, just another driver to ignore and dismiss. But what she didn't know was that the very person she underestimated would soon hold the key to her greatest deal, the difference between empire and collapse. 9 languages, years of hidden brilliance, and one shocking twist no one in that room could have predicted. How could a single moment of prejudice nearly cost billions? And what happened when the truth came crashing down? For most people, he was just the driver, a quiet presence in a crisp uniform, opening doors, weaving through traffic, waiting patiently while deals worth millions unfolded behind him. What they didn't see was the man himself, years of study, a sharp mind, and a gift for languages that could bridge worlds. He carried himself with humility, but beneath that calm exterior was a life marked by grit, resilience, and relentless learning. The CEO he worked for, on the other hand, saw nothing beyond her own reflection. To her, his talents were invisible, his worth reduced to the seat he occupied. Day after day, the difference in treatment was subtle yet cutting, a polite smile masking silent dismissal. And yet he endured. Still, the cracks were forming. A crucial deal was approaching, one that could make or break her empire. She thought the outcome depended solely on her. But soon, prejudice would blind her at the very moment she needed clarity most, and the driver she underestimated would become the one person standing between fortune and failure. The day of the deal arrived like a storm rolling across the horizon. Inside the towering glass building, every detail was sharpened with pressure. The polished floors, the immaculate suits, the gleaming folders marked with billion-dollar contracts. The room buzzed with tension, and yet, beneath it all, there was something more sinister, something unspoken. As the CEO swept into the lobby, her eyes barely brushed past the man who had driven her there. To her, he was part of the furniture, reliable enough to exist, but not important enough to acknowledge. The way she glanced at him, half amused whenever he held back his own words, carried a quiet cruelty. Worse, she often joked with colleagues about the irony of having a black driver when she herself was climbing the heights of global leadership. What she didn't recognize was how sharply her dismissive laughter cut into the soul of the man she so often overlooked. Still, he endured. He shouldered prejudice the same way he had shouldered long days of labor before this job, silently, with discipline that masked the ache beneath. He knew his role, knew how people chose to see him, but knowing didn't soften the sting. When you spend your life being reduced to your skin color or your job title, you learn to carry a different kind of weight. Injustice becomes familiar but never comfortable. That day, the boardroom pulsed with tension. Global partners had gathered, executives, negotiators, translators, all posturing for power across an ocean of cultural divides. Somewhere in the mix was a billion-dollar deal that could make her company untouchable, but also fragile. One misstep, one slip in communication, and everything could collapse. The problem became obvious within minutes. Words were flying across the room, but meanings were lost in translation. Subtle differences in tone, formalities, and phrasing sparked confusion. Smiles hid frustration. Every slight pause was magnified as disrespect. And with each strained exchange, the deal inched closer to falling apart. The professional translators, polished though they seemed, stumbled over intricacies they simply didn't grasp. The CEO grew flustered, eyes narrowing, voice clipped. To her, the failure was external. These translators weren't good enough, she thought. What she never considered was that the answer sat just outside the room, quietly waiting. The driver who had accompanied her through city after city was listening. Not officially, not as part of his job, but because languages were his world. 9 of them, spoken not from textbooks, but through immersion, survival, and human connection. He heard the cracks widening. He understood what neither side dared admit. Mistrust was spreading, thicker than the air between them, poisoning any chance of agreement. And as the deal slipped further from reach, he knew that silence could no longer protect him. But stepping forward was no small choice. Intervening would mean breaking the invisible boundary that had always kept him in his place. Worse, it would expose him to the scrutiny of a CEO who had never seen him as anything beyond a driver. Could he cross that line, knowing Prejudice sat like a wall in her mind? The room teetered on collapse. $1 billion trembled in the balance. And still, he stood outside, holding the knowledge nobody else possessed. The question wasn't whether he could save the deal. It was whether he would be allowed to. The boardroom was slipping into chaos. Voices overlapped, tempers flared, and the weight of misunderstanding pressed like a storm about to break. A $5 billion future was crumbling in slow motion, and every executive in the room felt the collapse drawing closer. The CEO's polished confidence cracked. Frustration etched into her voice as she barked for better translations, for clearer answers, her empire slipping through her hands. And then, out of the corner of the room, he moved. The driver. For a moment, no one noticed. He wasn't supposed to be part of the conversation, wasn't supposed to exist beyond the shadows. But with deliberate steps, he crossed an invisible line. His presence alone sparked confusion, gasps, raised eyebrows, a stiff silence that spread like wildfire. He opened his mouth, and suddenly the noise gave way to clarity. Words flowed from him with precision and grace. English into Mandarin, Mandarin into Arabic, Arabic into French, 9 languages shifting like waves. It wasn't just translation. It was understanding. He caught the nuance in tone, the unspoken respect embedded in each phrase, the cultural layers the professionals had failed to capture. The shift was immediate. Heads turned. The tension loosened. Misunderstandings unraveled like knots being pulled free. Where moments earlier opponents had bristled in mistrust, now they leaned forward, eyes narrowing not in anger but in curiosity, in possibility. And the CEO? She froze. The same woman who had laughed at him, dismissed him, reduced him to a stereotype, now sat powerless, watching as the man she had mocked became the center of the room. Every eye turned to him, every billion balanced on his words. Her empire, her legacy was in his hands, but this moment wasn't just about her. It was bigger. It was about every time someone like him had been silenced, underestimated, or overlooked. About the way prejudice blinds the powerful until it's too late. The air was electric. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. His voice carried not just meaning, but justice. And as silence returned, one truth became undeniable. The driver no longer stood in the shadows. He had become the light. When the meeting finally ended, the deal was signed. $5 billion secured. Executives shook hands, contracts exchanged smiles, and the company's future was safe. But the most striking image wasn't in the papers that day. It was in the stunned silence of a CEO who realized her empire had been saved, not by her sharpness or her power, but by the man she had laughed at and dismissed. For the driver, there was no trophy, no public recognition. He slipped back into the background just as quietly as he had stepped forward. Yet something had shifted. In that moment, he had forced a room full of leaders to confront a truth they could no longer ignore. Brilliance has no uniform, no skin color, no fixed role. Prejudice had blinded them, until reality tore the blindfold away. But outside that boardroom, the world doesn't always allow such reversals. Too often, stories like his end differently. Chances missed, talents buried, lives broken by bias that strips people of their dignity and opportunity. Racism doesn't always roar openly. Sometimes it works in silence, in the dismissive glance, in the mocking laugh, in the refusal to see a person's full humanity. This story isn't just about $1 billion deal. It's about the cost of prejudice, the doors it closes, the potential it wastes, the lives it diminishes. And it leaves us with a question that lingers long after the contracts are signed. How many voices are still being silenced today simply because no one bothered to listen?